Imagine a world where a decision by one man could shift the balance of power on a battlefield. What if Trump agreed to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles? In a recent turn of events, Ukraine has sought these long-range missiles from the United States, and the White House is contemplating the potential delivery. But what would this mean for the fight against Russian forces? The Tomahawk is an iconic American missile, designed for precision strikes against land and sea targets. Flying low to avoid detection, it can cover distances between 1,000 and 2,500 kilometers. Though these missiles have been in U.S. service since the early 1980s, they have undergone numerous upgrades over the decades. Unlike ballistic systems, Tomahawks are subsonic, making them targets that even older defense systems can intercept. Yet, their low flight path and maneuverability can mislead radar systems, necessitating sophisticated air defense mechanisms to properly counter them. This situation invites a comparison to Russia's Caliber missiles, which serve a similar purpose and possess comparable ranges, primarily launched from naval platforms. The deadly calibers have been frequently employed by Russian submarines and warships in strikes against Ukraine, and like the Tomahawk, they fall within the same range of 1,500 to 2,500 kilometers. So far, Ukrainian air defenses have been effective at downing calibers, particularly during the early phase of the conflict, when older Soviet S-300 systems were the primary line of defense. Even now, intercepting these missiles remains a challenge for Ukraine's military. While Tomahawks might face a similar fate, their design offers a different tactical profile, making them a complicated target for defense systems as their maneuvering capabilities can confuse intercepting units. The very prospect of Ukraine receiving Tomahawks raises critical questions. How would this change the dynamics of warfare? The mere presence of a weapon capable of reaching deep into Russia would transform strategic considerations. Major cities, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, would suddenly find themselves within striking distance. The implications would resonate beyond direct military engagement, potentially influencing public sentiment and fostering anti-war movements within Russia, as citizens demand protection from such threats. However, the logistics of employing Tomahawks remain uncertain. Currently, Ukraine lacks the naval vessels equipped to launch these missiles, relying instead on U.S. Navy ships or Allied submarines. Given the operational risks, particularly concerning vulnerability to drone strikes and ballistic missiles in the Black Sea, such a transfer seems fraught with challenges. As the debates unfold within the U.S. administration, the stakes could not be higher. If Tomahawks are handed over, what would Russia's response be? With tensions already soaring, any missile strikes launched from Ukrainian territory could be construed as acts of war, leading to a potential spiral of escalation. Would this trigger a direct response involving nuclear capabilities? The dangers are palpable. In this high-stakes game, Trump's decision to arm Ukraine could mark a pivotal moment. Will he summon the courage to deliver the Tomahawk, risking unleashing a torrent of consequences? The world is watching, and every decision could tip the scales of fate. What if a powerful weapon like the Tomahawk cruise missile fell into the hands of Ukraine? This terrifying possibility is looming as calls for the U.S. to send these long-range missiles gain traction. With the potential to strike deep into Russian territory, how would this change the battlefield dynamics and shift the balance of power? The Tomahawk, a hallmark of American military might, boasts a range that can stretch from 1,000 to 2,500 kilometers. This missile flies at low altitudes, cleverly maneuvering around the terrain to evade detection. Although it has been in service since the early 1980s and has undergone numerous upgrades, its effectiveness can still be challenged by existing air defense systems, especially given its subsonic speed of around 0.75 Mach. In comparison, Russian Caliber missiles, similar in purpose and range, travel slightly faster at 0.8 Mach, raising concerns that many Tomahawks might be intercepted, depending on their flight path. Historically, preparations for strikes involving Tomahawks date back to the Soviet era, highlighting their long-standing strategic significance. However, if Ukraine does receive these missiles, they may become a tempting target for Russian defenses. Stationing these assets in the Black Sea would likely expose them to swift attacks from Russian drones and ballistic missiles, given the right circumstances. Even the risk of loss is high as they may quickly be sunk if not properly guarded. But the potential deployment of Tomahawks signifies a seismic shift for Ukraine, complicating the military landscape for Russia. The reach of these missiles would encompass virtually all of European Russia, including industrial strongholds such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. To counter this threat, Russia would need to rely on an extensive network of air defense systems, vastly increasing their arsenal usage and triggering a war of attrition. Just one Tomahawk can deliver a devastating blow with a warhead weighing approximately 450 kilograms. In contrast, the lighter warheads of drones or ATACMS missiles, limited to 200 to 300 kilograms, often target less fortified objects. This stark difference elevates the stakes. Tomahawks could effectively neutralize key targets deep in Russia with precision and devastating efficiency, leading to a rippling impact on public sentiment within Russia itself. Ukraine and its Western allies would likely attempt to use these operations to stoke anti-war sentiments among the Russian populace, undermining trust in the authorities unable to shield the country from such strikes. Yet, there's a flip side to this coin. A strong public outcry for decisive retaliation against Ukraine could ensue. As the debate over where Ukraine could launch these missiles unfolds, one pivotal question arises. Tomahawks are primarily deployed from surface ships and submarines equipped with vertical launch systems, assets predominantly held by the US and its allies. But Ukraine lacks the naval capability to conduct such maritime strikes, and it seems increasingly unlikely that the US would provide these platforms. Without adequate launch platforms, the operational effectiveness of Tomahawks remains questionable. As we delve deeper into this topic, we must ask ourselves, is the world prepared for the ramifications of such military escalations? Would the US stance shift toward active involvement in a conflict many wish to keep distant? The crossroads lies ahead, and the choices made now could echo throughout history. In the last discussions, experts emphasized that the current ground launch configuration of the Typhoon system is deemed impractical. Its bulky shape makes it an easy target, raising concerns about its vulnerability on the battlefield. However, logistical hurdles in supplying Tomahawks to Ukraine pale in comparison to the critical issue of Russia's potential response. What if the US decided to give ground launch systems to Ukraine? Each strike would be heavily regulated by the United States. Therefore, any attack launched by Ukraine would be perceived as a direct action authorized by Washington. Russia has recently adjusted its nuclear doctrine to classify missile strikes from Western weapons, launched from Ukrainian territory, as an assault on the nation supplying the munitions. This change aimed to counter tactical missile strikes that Biden approved at the end of his presidency, later halted by Trump. If Ukraine were to deploy the far more potent Tomahawks, Moscow would likely interpret this as the US joining the conflict, especially if significant damage were inflicted or critical locations like the Kremlin were hit. Such attacks could escalate the stakes dramatically for Russia, fueling fears of retaliatory actions ranging from nuclear threats to strikes directly on Western targets. The ramifications could approach catastrophic levels, impacting global stability. Despite Trump's recent anti-Putin rhetoric, it seems he wishes to avoid a direct US conflict with Russia. Instead, he appears keen on shifting the burden of support for Ukraine onto Europe while pushing the EU to abandon dependency on Russian energy sources, effectively minimizing direct American involvement in the fray. The questions loom large. Will the US choose to arm Ukraine with Tomahawks, drastically shifting the battlefield dynamics? What would be the price of such an escalation? The world watches with bated breath, aware of the tipping point hovering on the horizon. Can the fragile balance of power withstand the weight of these potential decisions? In a world on the brink of conflict, the potential transfer of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine has ignited fierce debate. This decision, if made by the American leadership, could very well alter the dynamics of the ongoing war. Will Donald Trump take such a risk? This question looms large over the geopolitical landscape. The stakes are high. The deployment of Tomahawk missiles would allow Ukraine to strike deep within Russian territory, threatening major urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Imagine the tension as Ukrainian forces prepare for a strike that could inflict significant damage. The destructive power of these missiles, with their warheads weighing around 450 kilograms, is not to be underestimated. Yet, this is not merely a military calculation. Trump's administration is acutely aware of the blowback such a move could provoke from Russia. A retaliatory response might not only escalate military engagements but could also spiral into existential threats involving nuclear arsenals. The question remains, how will the global community react? The capability to launch these missiles from mobile land-based systems presents an option that has only been recently developed. But the reality is that Ukraine lacks the vessels capable of deploying these weapons effectively. The logistics involved could place American forces at greater risk if they were stationed in the Black Sea, vulnerable to counterattacks from Russian forces. Suppose the US does supply land-based launchers to Ukraine, provoking a harsh reaction from Moscow. Would this escalate into a broader confrontation? And would the conflict stretch beyond mere traditional warfare? The ramifications could be catastrophic not just for Ukraine or Russia, but for the entire world. Trump, despite appearing anti-Putin in light of recent events, seems focused on easing the burden on American resources. He may prefer to pass the baton of support to Europe, compelling EU nations to reduce reliance on Russian energy supplies. By doing so, he minimizes direct American involvement yet navigates a treacherous path ripe with potential for escalation. Whether Trump will embrace the challenge of sending Tomahawks to Ukraine remains an open question. The balance of power is precariously positioned, and the wrong move could ignite a firestorm, plunging nations into an unforeseen conflict. As the possibilities unfold, one thing is certain, the world is watching, holding its breath, waiting to see whether diplomacy will prevail or if the drums of war will grow louder. What fate awaits the geopolitical landscape, and will Trump's next decision mark a turning point in this high-stakes theater? The answer is as elusive as ever, teetering on the edge of chaos. Imagine a world on the brink of chaos, where the fate of nations hangs by a thread. What would happen if the United States were to grant Ukraine access to Tomahawk missiles? As Ukraine yearns for advanced weaponry, the White House deliberates the consequences. Tomahawks, stealthy long-range missiles, could wreak havoc across the battlefield. These missiles, developed to strike both land and sea targets, travel low to evade detection, striking at distances spanning from 1,000 to 2,500 kilometers. Despite their age, operational since the early 1980s, these missiles have undergone numerous upgrades. In contrast to ballistic systems, Tomahawks navigate at subsonic speeds, making them vulnerable to air defense systems, particularly those outdated. However, their low flight trajectories complicate detection, necessitating a well-coordinated defense. They are akin to Russia's Caliber missiles, employed in a similar manner, launched from submarines and ships against Ukraine. Both systems are believed to reach targets within a similar range, with Ukraine successfully intercepting Caliber attempts despite the odds. But what will Tomahawks mean for the ongoing conflict? With Ukraine launching these missiles, nearly all of European Russia, including major industrial hubs, could fall within striking distance. The implications would be monumental. Ukraine could target critical infrastructure, bringing the war to new heights. Yet, the question remains, how would Ukraine deploy these missiles? Primarily launched from surface ships and submarines equipped with universal launchers, Ukraine lacks the naval means to do so. The transfer of vessels capable of supporting such launches from the US seems highly unlikely. If somehow granted, these vessels would be prime targets for Russian drones and missile strikes, with high chances of being sunk if stationed in the Black Sea. Alternative options for land-based launches emerged post-INF Treaty. The FN Typhoon system, developed in 2019, allows for mobile ground installations to launch Tomahawks. However, its practicality remains unproven in real combat. Ground installations face significant challenges. They are cumbersome and thus more easily spotted and targeted by enemy forces. The heart of the matter lies in the potential repercussions from Russia. A U.S. decision to supply these missiles, or their launchers, would be seen as direct involvement in the war. Moscow would view any such strikes as acts of war, possibly leading to escalated tension across the globe, with nuclear fears creeping back into the minds of leaders. So, as the world watches and waits, the question looms, is the U.S. prepared to risk everything by unleashing Tomahawks into this already volatile conflict? What would the consequences be for Ukraine, Russia, and the world? As we delve deeper into the situation, we find ourselves pondering a critical question: what would happen if the U.S. were to provide Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles? These long-range weapons could dramatically alter the battlefield dynamics. Ukraine has requested these powerful missiles, and now the question lies with the White House: would they agree to this transfer? If the Tomahawks were indeed delivered, they could potentially be easy targets for Russian drones and ballistic strikes. If stationed in the Black Sea, the likelihood of them being quickly neutralized is high. While there's a theoretical scenario where the US or another nation provides Ukraine with a vessel capable of launching Tomahawks, the practicality of such a situation remains dubious. Ukraine lacks the naval assets equipped for this purpose. Imagine Ukrainian forces managing a warship, however distant that sounds. Training a crew for advanced missile systems in a short span sounds challenging. It's likely foreign military personnel would be involved in this complex task. Traditionally, Tomahawks launch from naval ships. However, after the US exited a particular treaty, an alternative ground launch system was developed, known as FN Typhoon. This system allows for Tomahawk deployment from mobile land units but has yet to be used in actual combat situations. Currently, the primary launch method remains naval. However, the land-based option presents a more feasible route for Ukraine, should the US decide to supply the weapons. Yet, questions linger about how many land launching systems the US possesses and their readiness for a large-scale conventional conflict. Reports indicate that only a limited deployment of the Typhoon system has occurred, namely in the Philippines and during exercises in Australia, with Germany potentially receiving it in 2026. Despite the technological advancements, concerns arise about the Typhoon system's bulkiness, which could render it vulnerable on the battlefield. As events unfold, one must wonder, what would be the ultimate reaction of Russia to such a shift in military capabilities? Would provocations escalate into something far more dangerous? The stakes are high, and the response could determine the future of the conflict.